When a 62-year-old man was publicly questioned about his right to sit in first class, he didn't yell or argue. He didn't need to. By the time the plane landed, his calm, measured response had gone viral, and the airline found itself scrambling to manage the fallout. The man's name was Leonard Harris. At 62, Leonard carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who had nothing to prove. Broad-shouldered, silver streaks lining his neatly cut hair, and eyes that had witnessed more than most could imagine, he walked through Gate C-12 at Phoenix Sky Harbor with the calm assurance of a man who knew exactly who he was. Dressed in a navy linen blazer, crisp khakis, and leather shoes polished to a soft shine, Leonard was every bit the gentleman. In his right hand, he held a well-worn leather-bound collection of Langston Hughes poetry, his constant travel companion. "It reminds me who I am and where I come from," he always said. His left hand held his boarding pass. C2A, first class, flight 349 to Seattle, boarding right on time. This trip was his reward to himself. After nearly 40 years as a dedicated high school principal in Birmingham, Alabama, Leonard finally took a moment to enjoy a bit of peace. No family, no obligations, just the soft hum of the airplane, the view from the window, a cold drink, and the familiar comfort of his poetry. At the boarding door, Leonard greeted the flight attendant with a warm smile and a gentle, "How you doing?" She smiled back, a bit surprised by the kindness in his voice, and directed him toward the front row. Leonard slid into his seat, adjusted the overhead air nozzle, folded his blazer neatly across his lap, and opened to a dog-eared page of his book. The cabin slowly filled with other passengers, quiet conversations buzzing softly, the rustling of bags stowed overhead, and the half-smiles of strangers preparing to share the same airspace for the next few hours. Then came Captain Mason Blake, tall, tan, and dripping with the kind of arrogance that had been allowed to ferment unchecked for too long. Blake had the swagger of a man who wore sunglasses indoors and referred to the flight crew as the kids. He strode through the first-class cabin like he owned not only the plane but the people aboard it. Nodding to familiar faces, clapping one man on the back, and chuckling at an inside joke with the flight engineer, Blake stopped abruptly at row 2, right in front of Leonard. There was a pause, not long, but long enough to sour the air between them. "Sir," Blake said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear, tinged with condescension. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Leonard didn't blink. He calmly closed his book, lifted his boarding pass, and replied, "That's what it says." Blake squinted at the ticket, then at Leonard, then back at the seat. A forced grin tugged at the corners of his mouth, but his eyes betrayed a different sentiment. "Well," he muttered, his voice dripping with contempt, "I suppose they're letting just about anyone up here now." It wasn't the words themselves, it was the tone, the dismissive smirk that came with them. The woman seated across the aisle stiffened. Her husband, seated beside her, instinctively raised his phone and began recording. Leonard didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, looked the pilot squarely in the eye, and said, "I believe I've earned this seat, just like everyone else." Blake let out a soft, derisive chuckle, muttered something inaudible under his breath, and continued on toward the cockpit. The phone kept recording. And just like that, everything began to shift. The pilot's words hadn't been loud, but they had been clear enough. The energy inside the plane shifted, subtle but undeniable. Whispers moved through the cabin as people exchanged glances. The woman across the aisle leaned toward her husband. "You got it all?" she whispered. He nodded. "Every second." "Should we post it?" she asked. He nodded again. "People need to see this. It's not right." The plane hadn't even left the gate. What Blake didn't know was that Leonard Harris had spent his entire life facing moments just like this. Raised in Shreveport, Louisiana, in a modest house where the front porch sagged a little to one side, Leonard learned early that dignity didn't come from others, it came from within. His father, Samuel Harris, a school janitor, was one of the smartest men Leonard had ever known. Samuel never made it past the 8th grade but could recite Baldwin by heart and taught his son the value of self-respect. "Don't ever let another man's ignorance become your truth," Samuel used to say. "Most folks barely know themselves, let alone you." Leonard carried that lesson into every classroom he entered, every meeting, every encounter where someone questioned his place or his worth. He didn't shout. He didn't demand. He simply existed, firm, kind, and unshakably present. He had spent decades mentoring students who went on to become lawyers, engineers, teachers, and soldiers. They returned to shake his hand, tears in their eyes, grateful that he had believed in them when others hadn't. But for all the lives he touched, there were always those moments, the store clerk shadowing him through aisles, the woman clutching her purse tighter as he walked by, the car salesman assuming he was lost when he walked into the showroom. Each time, Leonard responded the same way with calm questions, not anger. Would you say that to someone else? Or is it just that I don't fit the picture you had in your mind? So when Captain Blake questioned his place in first class, it was just another version of the same disrespect Leonard had encountered all his life. Different setting, same insult. But this time, the world was watching. The video uploaded by Brian Lattimore, the man across the aisle, started picking up traction before the plane even took off. No captions, just a simple quote, "Sure you did, Captain. Flight 349. By the time the wheels lifted off the ground, the video had already racked up thousands of views. Reddit threads sprang to life. TikTok duets began dissecting the moment. The internet had no patience for microaggressions caught on camera. Leonard, unaware, read the same stanza 3 times without registering the words. Something stirred in his chest, not anger, not shame, just a familiar knowing. This wasn't about him. Not really. It was about a system that still questioned who belonged where. Halfway to Seattle, the ripple turned into a wave. The clip, just 22 seconds long, bounced from one social media platform to another. It caught the attention of educators, civil rights activists, airline employees, and everyday passengers who had their own stories of being doubted, questioned, or humiliated. Hashtags emerged. Flight 349. Leonard Harris. Earned my seat. Within hours, Leonard's name was matched to a retired principal from a feature in a local newspaper. A photo of him smiling proudly in a cap and gown alongside 3 graduating seniors began circulating with the caption, "This is the man the pilot tried to humiliate. He spent his life lifting others. He deserves better." The airline's PR department caught wind of the brewing storm as the flight cruised over Nevada. At first, they issued the blandest of statements. "We are aware of an incident aboard Flight 349 and are conducting an internal review." It didn't help. Screenshots of past complaints against Captain Blake surfaced quickly. Anonymous posts from airline staff painted a consistent picture: arrogance, entitlement, a history of belittling passengers and crew alike. The whispers grew louder, the outrage sharper. And Leonard? Still in his seat, sipping ginger ale, eyes on his poetry. When the plane touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, passengers gathered their belongings. There was a quiet tension in the air, no shouting, no confrontation, just a collective awareness of the moment they had witnessed. As Leonard stood to grab his carry-on, Brian Lattimore leaned across the aisle. "Sir, before you go, there's something you should know." Leonard turned, calm as ever. Brian held out his phone, the screen showing the viral video. Leonard's face frozen mid-sentence. "It's gone viral. People are talking. A lot." Leonard's eyes met the screen. His expression didn't change. "You recorded it?" "I did. I wasn't going to post it, but it didn't feel right to let it slide." Leonard nodded slowly. "Thank you." No anger. No resentment. Just acknowledgement. By the time Leonard stepped off the plane, his name was on national news. Radio segments analyzed the pilot's words. Television anchors debated microaggressions, professionalism, and respect. The airline tried damage control. More statements. Promises of accountability. But screenshots of old voicemails from Blake began to surface, mocking messages left for crew members who had challenged him, arrogance on full display. One clip from a retired flight attendant sealed Blake's fate: "You can cry to HR all you want. They'll side with me. They always do." This time, they didn't. Captain Mason Blake was suspended pending investigation. Quietly, behind closed doors. But the internet doesn't forget. Leonard, meanwhile, fielded phone calls from journalists, former students, and strangers thanking him for his grace. One call stood out: a young woman who said, "You were my principal. I just wanted to say thank you for teaching us to hold our heads high." Leonard smiled softly. "I'm just glad someone was paying attention." When asked if he wanted to make a public statement, Leonard chose to speak with Denise Corbin, a respected journalist known for real stories, not sound bites. They met quietly at a community center gymnasium 2 days later. No lights, no stage, just 2 chairs and a camera. Denise asked, "Mr. Harris, when the pilot questioned you, What went through your mind? Leonard paused. I've been asked if I belong in a lot of rooms in my life. That one just happened to have wings. The quote caught fire. Not out of rage, but respect. Respect for a man who had every reason to lash out but chose dignity instead. Leonard didn't call for boycotts. He didn't demand anyone lose their job. He spoke of presence, of standing or sitting firmly in the space you've earned. You can't control how someone sees you, he told Denise, but you can control how you see yourself. The airline couldn't ignore the pressure. Training programs were revamped. Policies rewritten. Sensitivity workshops were implemented across the company. The new conduct code was named the Harris Standard. Leonard, ever humble, shook his head when asked about the name. I didn't write any code. I just sat down. But he understood the weight of it. This was bigger than him. It always had been. Blake's contract was terminated quietly weeks later. No fanfare. Just a silent acknowledgement that the culture had to change. Leonard returned home to his modest house, the porch swing creaking softly in the breeze. His granddaughter Ava climbed into his lap one evening. Grandpa, Mommy said you were on the news. Did you do something bad? He chuckled. No, baby. I just sat down. She frowned. Why were people mad then? Leonard sighed. Because some folks don't like seeing certain people in certain places. And when they do, it makes them uncomfortable. Ava crossed her arms defiantly. That's silly. Leonard smiled and kissed her forehead. It is, sweetheart. But it's been happening a long time. But you didn't yell, she said thoughtfully. You just stayed sitting. That's cool. Leonard smiled wider. Sometimes staying still is the loudest thing you can do. The headlines faded. Hashtags moved on. But the lesson stayed. One quiet man, seated firmly where he belonged, showed the world that dignity doesn't need to shout. It simply stands its ground and waits for the world to catch up.